Hi, everyone. I'm here with Gaby Giessen today. Gaby, you're part of Boston Consulting Group, and you've been working with Boston Henderson Institute, which is the research arm, looking around the future of work and doing some work really around that. Thanks very much for joining me. And I think we'd first come across each other or started talking really around some of the work you've done around work practices, looking at remote versus not, and particularly this idea around enjoyment at work a little bit as well. Do you want to maybe just start off by maybe just explaining a little bit about what that research is and how you've got involved in it?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, I'm working with a senior partner in the United States, and her kind of preliminary research question was what's the future model for work? What is the
Mm,
right answer to the hybrid debate, that kind of thing. And when we were going through that research, we did a couple of employee surveys and client surveys to better understand employee needs and the underlying kind of motivators for remote work, for hybrid ways of working. And through that research, we actually found it's not really about the number of days you're in the office. It's about designing work and ways of working to deliver employee joy. And the kind of key finding that motivated the research going forward was that enjoying work reduces attrition risk. And I say that and it sounds pretty straightforward and simple, but I think what's crazy is the magnitude of the impact. So we saw with office-based workers, if you enjoy your work, attrition risk goes down by 50%. And with what we call frontline or deskless workers, that's 60%. So just a huge impact.
What I loved about it and why I was reaching out was really it's actually hard data to talk about something that we actually know to a certain extent. Most of us know that if you don't really like a part of your job, then you get a bit disgruntled, and if you love another part, you stick around. But it was actually the hard data that kind of demonstrated some of that, I thought. And I think the other thing that surprised me was just how low some of the thresholds were as well. I think was it 4 hours a week? It was only is it 4 hours a week? That was really around, so like from a toil point of view, if you have that, then that's enough to increase attrition risk.
Yeah, what we've been talking about is what we found as the toil tolerance amongst our
Mm,
working populations. And interestingly, we've seen different toil tolerances again between office-based workers and frontline or deskless workers. 4 hours, as you said, for office-based and up to 8 hours for deskless. But what I think is also important to note is there's a ratio with joy. So it's if you looked at the way when we double clicked on people's time and the share of time on joyful versus toilful work, that ratio is quite important. And we did some analysis to the sensitivities to a decrease in joy versus an increase in toil. And when we talk about attrition risk, and we found that office-based workers are as sensitive to a 1 hour increase in toil as a 1 hour decrease in joy. So they have this very kind of high sensitivity to toil at work, whereas deskless workers are much, much more sensitive to a decrease in joy. And I think just to close out the point, the one thing we would say is toil is a very specific type of kind of painful work. It's not challenging work, it's not difficult work. It's work where the effort required isn't commensurate with the value derived. So admin, think sludge, think just the work that you dread every day where you know you're not getting any benefit from doing that.
And on the joy side of the equation, I think it was 10 hours a week, which I was doing the calculation back in my mind, so especially from a call center point of view, which is 10 hours over a 40-hour week, that's like 25%, which sort of fits in with things like attrition rates when you look at like occupancy and a sort of availability, those kind of things as well. So again, it was hard data that sort of supported that, which is you've got to have the 25% of which is kind of like what people enjoy doing, that then they can then do the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think what was super interesting when we looked at understanding joy in the day to day was what people enjoy is very different. So some people
Mm.
love doing the focus work, the double clicking into data, spending time in the details. Some people love doing client engagements and speaking to other people and networking and things like that. Yeah, joy is super important. I think the other part of that like equation is that there's a lot of neutral time, right? There's a lot of time that
Mm.
is neither joyful nor toilful. And how can we convert that into joy? Because it could also mean that it's a buffer for any increases in toil. So there's two sides to this equation. And I think you can only increase toil so much without offsetting it by joy.
Yeah.
And a lot of things for companies to think about.
I think the ratio point's interesting as much as the absolute values, as you say. It's the ratios of the two and the different sensitivities between the two as well, particularly if you're looking at swap sets and those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think what we recommend is like the research that you're speaking to is external surveys that we did with the market. And I think what would be like what we try to do with our clients is make this very specific to them. So understanding the roles, the segments, the sectors that they're in to make sure that kind of toss-based joy scoring is really specific and you can really understand what people love and
Yeah.
care about.
Now, remote working and going back to the office has been a hot topic. I was reading something, I think even last night, about some of the largest companies asking people to go back 5 days a week. This data gave a bit of a different perspective in terms of you've always got to be back in the office to like being a little bit more like hybrid or remote work. And it felt like it had what people want maybe is a little bit different, maybe than what we're hearing in the media, really.
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting is, and this is based on the US markets, but if you, every time we saw bad earnings announcements, we saw RTO mandates come back into play. CEOs, there was a particular kind of like pattern coming back in 2022 to 23, where after the company disappointed the market, you saw the CEO apply an RTO mandate. And I think our research has basically shown two things. One, like a hybrid policy is not about the number of days you're in the office. It's about empowering employees to work in the way that's best suited to them at the team level. We don't want to go down to the individual because it becomes quite chaotic, but really letting teams set the norms and standards that allow them to do the work that they need to do in the most effective way possible and balancing people's preferences. And mandates are just never well received. So I think like the underlying employee need is about flexibility and autonomy, and we should service that. And then the right decision is made at the team level. Those are our key findings from that research.
And if you do need to go into the office, where do things like commuting time kind of fit in? Because that can be almost like seen as toil as well. So I
Yeah.
know you might perceive it as being like within the working hours, but actually to a person or to an individual, the working hours might actually be extended to when you leave home to when you return back to home. Do you
Yeah.
think that part of it could come into it in terms of even perceptions around commuting time being toil and whether you enjoy it? Some people enjoy it, but a lot of people don't.
A lot of people don't. And I think that the organization has to understand that most people's mindset is their working hours include their commute. So when they think about their day, even
Mm.
if they're not actively working, that commute is part of it. So that's part of their equation. And I think the kind of standard, the simple phrase is make the commute worthwhile. When you are co-locating, ensure that it's for work that requires collaboration and is done better in person. So one of the things that we've seen is if you have a structured hybrid policy, so people have to be in 3 days a week, but they don't coordinate amongst teams or they don't use that time for specific kind of collaborative working, that's where the drain comes from. That's when the commute isn't worthwhile. It's just really about understanding, and this is why the decision being at the team level makes sense because they know what work needs to get done and how best to do it.
I was looking through some of the data, and I think I'll put links into some of the publicly available stuff in with the video. But it was like team-driven decision making seemed to that had that sort of better match between like joy at being in the office and sort of the effectiveness. And you just wonder if that's where that hybrid piece comes in. So it's like be in when you need to make team decisions. But I also wonder if that also links back to why there's a bit of a disconnect between maybe some of the leadership of some of the larger companies versus maybe the rest of the company, because they like to have that team around them making the decisions. So they probably find that more joyful or more effective. Whereas some of the other people, they don't do that all the time. So they end up generating more toil as a result.
Yeah, and I think this is quite interesting when we start talking about like generational change and expectations of different generations in the workforce. So a lot of these leaders have obviously grown up in a culture where you're at the office, that's where you can get work done. Some of them previously in offices before mobile phones and emails. So that's the norm that they know. And there's a little bit of like unlearning or relearning that these leaders have to do about how to manage distributed teams, how to get the best out of their people. And they will get the best out of their people if their people are happy and feel that they're not being monitored or, that being patrolled for FaceTime, for all of these things. So I don't know, there's something I think at the leadership level to understand that preferences have changed. We did see some benefits. We can't dismiss everything we learned in the pandemic. Some people want to be at home, and there are benefits to doing certain types of work out of the office.
Yeah. Do you think the results would change over time? Because as humans, we evolve over time, don't we? So our relationship with hybrid working, for example, has evolved, as you said, over since the pandemic. Do you think our attitudes and maybe even your survey results will evolve over time as people get used to new ways of working? And do you think we're going to see this, even the results you've got, evolve as we get more used to it, or as our attitudes to work kind of change?
I think there's the interesting thing is we've seen two very different labor market dynamics in that period,
Mm,
right? We had very tight labor markets for a while where employees had a lot of the bargaining power. And so I think they could have identified jobs or picked organizations that align better to their preferences. And now we're starting to see like labor markets loosen a little bit. So I'm curious to see how preferences change in that environment, especially as we started to see Gen AI fear creep in as well. There's a lot of
mm.
people who are worried about obsolescence. And we did a survey actually, not my team, but another team at BCG. And you started to see work-life balance and remote working policies go down in the list of preferences as job security and career opportunity and learning and development preferences shot up. So I do wonder how that will shift. But I do think there are certainly benefits to hybrid ways of working, and we shouldn't be too quick to go straight back into the office and how we used to work.
And I suppose to a certain extent, your point is that things will change, but you have to just keep on measuring it and then
Yeah.
reacting to what actually the data says in the moment. So even this study isn't one and done. It's the fact that what's the snapshot at the moment, and then what does that mean in terms of toil versus joy versus effectiveness, and then what does that mean in terms of attrition rates? And it's at that time in the moment. So you've got to get in and measure it and understanding how that's changing to then be effective in the moment going forward.
Yeah, I think you lean into a bigger point and broader point that we're trying to make, which is the way we typically measure employee engagement today is probably quite ineffective. A lot of companies are still on these one-off annual cycles.
Mm.
They go away for months and do these months and months of analysis, and then they report back, but it's usually quite far away from the time the survey was taken. So I think the kind of underlying point is how do we make sure the ways of working that are working on a kind of more kind of frequent and how a frequent kind of cycle, and how do we make sure that we react to any feedback where we
Mm.
start to see loss of joy, effectiveness of any of these things. I do think there's a bit of a muscle to be more employee centric and more kind of employee or led by the employee voice when we have any of these debates, whether it's hybrid ways of working or new work tools such as Gen AI, those kind of things.
Yeah, but I suppose the data links to attrition and retention, which links to costs as well for companies as well. So there's
Yeah,
the real
and not
business
just
links there, right?
yeah, and not just sorry to interrupt, not just cost, but I think the other thing that like companies, it's quite easy to articulate the cost of attrition, right? We have replacement costs, we have training costs, we can see that on a cash flow statement. But what I think a lot of organizations tend to underestimate is the uplift and the revenue generation from engaged employees and positive employees. And we've seen a
Mm.
couple of seminal studies on this, anywhere from 13 to 19%, is the kind of productivity gap we see between highly engaged or happier employees versus kind of neutral employees.
Now, before you mentioned Gen AI and so like, and how that can overlay, what are you seeing as being the opportunity of that? And it does feel like Gen AI was super hot topic last year. This year, it feels like a little bit less, but it is still still going on in terms of like
Yeah.
how you can use that to streamline your processes, streamline what you might do. How can that get used to either generate more joy or to reduce toil?
Yeah, I think actually it's like almost a perfectly timed opportunity for us to really push organizations to be more employee centric, because Gen AI it's not a typical new IT tool. It's going to change how we work. In so many different ways. And I think it has huge potential. But I think where you're starting to see already is Gen AI missing its mark, missing the headlines are, where's this productivity uplift we were promised? Or it's not unlocking the same kind of cost savings that we expected. And a lot of that is down to like adoption and the way it's being deployed and designed. So we did a survey with C-suite executives, and 90% of them said Gen AI was one of their top three investments for 2024. And only 39% of them said that they had a people plan. So they had plans for trainings, for use cases, for deployment, for comms. And I think when you have that gap, you're inevitably not going to see the uplift you expect. And so just circling back to your point about using Gen AI, like I think the low hanging fruit is immensely obvious. Do the joy toil analysis, and where are people suffering? What work do people hate? And can we point Gen AI or other tools to circumvent that or make that work easier or more joyful simple and less cumbersome.
I was reading one of your papers, and I think which was talking about like how you actually roll Gen AI out, which is, so do you have that as a team? Do you provide, if you just throw it at people, then they ignore it or they don't want to do it. But actually it's like the change management for how you actually roll that out and how you implement it and almost have groups of teams, I think was working together makes a big difference in terms of the adoption.
Yep. Absolutely. So we like to call this design for adoption. And
Mm.
so we did experiments with our own business services teams in the United States, chiefly our kind of admin staff. And it was interesting. BCG was in the process of rolling out a new calendaring tool. And we did the joy toil kind of analysis and wanted to understand where the pain points were. And it was interesting. So on calendaring, EAs love landing the meeting. They love getting all the pieces together, almost like a Tetris or a puzzle, trying to get when that one meeting lands with all these kind of senior stakeholders, they love that process. But what they don't like is sourcing everyone's availability. So we get that feedback into the tool, the third party provider of the tool, and they updated the functionality to align with the output from our Joy Toil work. And so you start seeing people using these tools, liking these tools, and being less scared of Gen AI, being more higher belief in Gen AI. And it was a really powerful, virtuous cycle.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Which is, so if you use Gen AI to take the toil out or things you really don't like, then that can be a benefit. But if you use it to take the joy out, even if there are things that can be easily done, and actually the things you actually enjoy doing every day, then that can be a negative as well. So there's a real balance in terms of how you actually implement it into processes rather than just try and do it for everything. So that's a real kind of nuanced kind of point that the data kind of supports to a certain extent.
Yeah, 100%. I think you just need to know what your employees like, what your employees dislike, and then point it in the right way. And then I also think it comes back to this kind of iterative cycle with employee feedback. When we were running these experiments, we had pulse checks every 2 weeks to understand if the tool was delivering on what they expected, if there was anything else they would like to change, and integrated that feedback into, again, the tool design. So I think, first of all, you need voice of the employee into the kind of strategic choices you make around Gen AI and which use cases you prioritize. But also, as the tool is being deployed, make sure you engage your employees. Otherwise, you're
Yeah.
not going to see the uplift you expect.
It doesn't seem like it's not Gen AI versus human. It's like it's another hybrid model, isn't it? It's like how do you work together and get things working together to a certain extent. And another challenge that potentially you can have, and I don't know how you do this, whenever new technology comes in, it's usually there is a productivity gain. How do we make sure that productivity gain isn't just taken to a certain extent, and then you end up just filling it with more work? You actually fill it with work that's going to be joyful rather than work that's just more toil to a certain extent. I mean, any kind of thoughts around like how to guard against that? Because it's very easy just to take that as a productivity gain, but it might be the wrong thing to do from a retention point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest kind of human characteristics when we start talking about organizational change is people are scared of being asked to do more with less.
Yeah.
There is this kind of idea that any change initiative is with only efficiency and effectiveness or productivity in mind and doesn't have the kind of employee or the value to the employee at the center of it. So I think one of the things we've encouraged people to do is understand, like, where are you on this kind of attrition risk scale, and are your employees at the precipice of burnout? If that's the case, then give them back the time. Just let Gen AI be this complement to their abilities and make them able to do their work more quickly, or share the kind of productivity gains with them. The other thing to do is, again, ask, what work do you like to do and what work would you want to do if you had more time? So if we built that into our survey, and we see really interesting results, and a lot of people don't actually want the time back. They want to do trainings, they want to do affiliation, they want to do growth and personal development. So it's not as simple as people are automatically going to take the time, but you need to understand what your employees want.
I spend a lot of time in call centers and particularly working in call centers, and that's one of the things. It's going to be something that I suppose operational managers have to think about, which is if you save some of the time, do you replace that with additional training or higher skilled work rather than just more calls coming in, which can be difficult when you've got high abandon rates, you've got high number of calls in queue, those kind of things, and then there's pressures around that. But it seems like that's quite important just to be really deliberate around thinking around how you make those, say, swap sets of time to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's actually quite key, if you really do need to unlock productivity, as you said, you have these high queue rates, you have a high abandonment rates, and there is like a productivity problem because you have a capacity limit, then explaining the why to your employees is also hugely important, and saying, look, we're designing this tool to manage these calls X to Y.
Mm,
Is there anything that we've missed? What do you think? And getting their voice is going to be hugely powerful. There's something called the Hawthorne effect, which is just merely by asking people, how do you feel? They feel better about the organization. So this is
mm.
a kind of organizational science. And people being able to express their opinions or their views about the tooling or where it can be applied will just make them feel better just simply by being engaged on that dimension. And I think yeah, so I think explaining the why and that there's a productivity problem, it will help land the tool better and get your people on side as that change is being delivered.
Yeah. Job security is always a big concern as well in terms of retention, as much as the joy versus toil to a certain extent. That's usually a top concern for people. And I think it has been a top concern with Gen AI coming in too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes in part with having an understanding of how people would want to use the work, because they might want to
Mm,
be doing the more kind of challenging calls, the more sophisticated strategic calls with their
mm,
clients, that kind of thing. So understanding how people want to spend the time freed up will be important. And then matching that with the ability, like it is, I want to spend time on more complex calls, giving them the training and tooling. And again, positioning Gen AI as a complement, not a substitute. So how does this tool enable you to do the work you want? I think will get a lot of people on side, and then actually delivering on that promise of helping people do more of the work they want.
okay. So you guys obviously spend a lot of time at clients in industries implementing some of this, measuring some of this. How widely adopted, or do you think this thinking is? Is this revolutionary thinking, or are there real gaps, or do you think this is fairly well understood? How do you see it in terms of like rollout?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the kind of organizations we see that are furthest along on this journey are interestingly where the employee has a very big impact on customer. Because I think
Mm,
what's become very clear through the research and over time is that customers can't have a good experience if employees are stressed, stretched, angry, absent. So I think we see it in a lot of retail kind of stores where the customer experience is defined by their engagement with employees, that organizations are thinking more and more about how to design work to make employees happier. That being said, I think especially in the context of high cost, high inflation, we started to see employee kind of retention as an issue fall down the kind of priority list. And a lot of the time, even well-intended companies focus too much or ask too much of HR in this kind of capacity. So
mm,
they'll say, HR, please fix this retention crisis but you can't change as HR the day-to-day experience. You can't
mm.
change how the managers treat their people. You're not there on the ground with the workers who are struggling to find joy in their day-to-day. So I think the kind of what we do need, even the most well-intentioned companies need to recognize that HR has a limit in terms of how much it can impact, and really start making employee or delivering employee joy a kind of priority for managers, for people on the ground, for people in ops, and really
Yeah.
bring it from HR to ops.
I think it's an interesting counterpoint. We all seem to go through cycles, either in terms of periods of revenue growth or economic growth, and then periods of or cycles of negative growth or cost inflation, essentially. And there's this cost focus. And it feels like today we're moving into this much more sort of cost focus, cost control kind of manner. But I suppose this making sure you don't lose the voice of the employee to a certain extent, and you're focusing on actually what the tasks are. It's actually important to not only controlling costs, but then also making sure you actually got the growth and better customer treatment and all of those kind of things as well. So it's like the data that sort of like supports, you know, don't forget about this stuff because it's important even if we are trying to control costs.
So it does
Mm.
show you that if you embed employee centricity in how you do it, no matter what your business context, you'll have better outcomes in the long run.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's a salient point, just where we seem to sit today in terms of looking to the future. Where do you think it will evolve from here? Do you think, and where do you think the research is going to go from here?
Yeah, I think what will be interesting is just one of the things that we struggle with is what's the value of this? What's the number you can put on an ROI done in an employee-centric delivery versus a typical change delivery? And I think what we're trying to really focus on is building out those kind of case studies and marquee case studies where we can really definitively say, this is the uplift you can associate with a more employee-centric view, just to get the naysayers on board. I think it is really clear to us and to a lot of leaders that happy employees drive happy customers, drive business outcomes. But we want people to live and breathe that ideology. And so I think, yeah, our research is just going to be continuing to build out our portfolio of where we've done this and our proof points.
Yeah, Gabby, it's a fascinating piece of research. I absolutely loved it. So what I'll do is I say I'll put links into to the articles and what sort of where people can download it. And I really appreciate you making the time. It's super interesting.
No, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share our work.
Great, thanks very much.